of Ukraine. Yes. The panelists, I'm very pleased to introduce them from your left, Mette from Sabancı University, Tom Kazier from the University of Kent, Olga Buliuk from University of Amsterdam, quite recently, and Gergana Nucheva from Maastricht University. So I've suggested to the panelists that they take about 10 minutes each to start with, and then we can open for a general discussion, and I hope you will all take part in that. So shall we start on the left?
Okay, no problem. Thank you, Helen. Can I can't talk while I'm sitting. So wait for your Angela, and it will also probably keep you warm a little. Just
Here, so that you have the camera and in the microphone. Maybe
okay.
you want to have my...
No. So so we all have to come here now.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Olga. Okay, perfect. No, it's okay. I'll just, so where is the sound? The microphone is here.
Yeah.
That's why. Okay, fine. Well, we already talked with Helena that we want to keep this relatively short in terms of the general introductions for the panel, and then to have a more interactive, at least discussion on the Europe's turning point. So it's always a bit problematic to be the first speaker and also the last speaker. So somebody has to be in the middle in any case. But in order to make some of the points that could start, our discussion, is the first thing to probably actually pose is when we talk about the turning point for Europe, what is it actually? What is it actually we mean? So we are already living through this, extremely uncertain and turbulent process of change that came unexpectedly to a certain extent with the Russian invasion in Ukraine. But whether that's actually a point in time or a culmination of multiple processes that eventually led to this point and finally burst out in the open is actually a question that we need to discuss more. And on top of that, when we discuss or when we talk about Europe's turning point, perhaps we can actually pose this question. Are we going through something similar to what happened in 1989, perhaps 1990? Is this bringing forward unforeseen security risks and challenges for European security and for every other actor that is more or less involved? Or is it just, a turn of events, perhaps to a certain extent, like what happened in the Balkan Wars in 1992, where, some scholars were, similarly arguing that this is a major unprecedented security problem, but it turned out to be, contained at least to a certain extent. So the first thing probably is to, just put out on the table as a point for discussion is whether the current crisis we are living through is at a comparable crisis to the major turning points in European history, like the end of the Cold War. And then the second point that directly comes, associated with that is if it indeed is a major turning point similar to what happened in 1989 and 1990, then where do we go from here? Now, where do we go from here has two related components. One is the institutional responses. A lot of the papers that we listened to yesterday and today are dealing with something similar in terms of the European Union's capacity and ability to react back to what is happening currently on the ground. There, we heard some more, positive, some relatively pessimistic evaluations. the European Union is not known for its agility and adaptiveness to security and foreign policy related issues. So again, a second related point that I'm sure my fellow panelists will take upon is whether the EU is able to respond to the current security crisis and the major turning point in a way that we expect it to, or whether it's actually acquiring a new level of agility that, that might be peculiar to the European Union to start with, or that automatically then ties to some of the questions that Robert, Oscar, Eva, who was in the audience here, we are dealing with another H2020 project on European foreign policy engaged, whether the European Union is defining multiple partners for itself, and European foreign policy is evolving into a more effective policy, and whether the EU is acquiring capabilities that will enable it to deal with these security risks. And the third component of my opening points is related to there was a paper that you listened to from Turkey earlier in the previous session, but to the Turkish conundrum, okay, or the very difficult position that countries like United Kingdom, Turkey, who are strategic partners of the European Union, who play a very important role in European security as NATO members for a very long time, as key players now on the outflanks of the European continent, play in this exact turning point. And this then poses a directly related question to that. Is there a convergence of perceptions over, bless you, Heidi, over the security risks that we are encountering? That is Turkey, for example, perceiving Russia in the same way, let's say, Central and Eastern Europeans are, or Germany, or France, or United Kingdom? So is, what Russia is doing currently on the ground, is it perceived in a similar fashion by all the related players, including the EU and NATO members? And if not, if there is, a continuation of a deep divide within the EU or NATO, for that matter, in the way they define security risks and security challenges, that automatically brings forth, and the expected outcome that this division will automatically translate into a way of finding different tools, different policy instruments to respond to the security challenges. So I think my 10 minutes is up. And those are just, some of the bullet points that I wanted to raise. So is this actually a turning point? If so, in what magnitude? Institutionally, are the institutions that we have on the ground sufficient to deal with these new challenges that the turning point has brought? And then beyond the institutional format, at the state level, is there a divergence between what we call European states, including Turkey, over the perceptions of the turning point, security risks, and the proper tools to deal with these? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Can we move on to Tom then, who will talk about how we should understand the Russian position, with a particular emphasis perhaps on domestic politics?
Exactly, that's correct. Good afternoon. I'll start by saying I think this is a very significant turning point in many different ways, and I'll try to make clear why I think that's the case, but also try to make clear how we may possibly misunderstand to a certain degree what is going on. I think the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February, is a new fact, or maybe even worse than that. It's the return of an old fact in Europe. It's the return of massive interstate war aimed at annexation, aimed at territorial expansion, with brutal force, massive use of force, in particular if you think how the war started on 3 different fronts. And that is, of course, the return of an old fact we do not want to see return, because it was what triggered the Second World War. And it has become, for that reason, one of the cornerstones of any European security order. That is, that you do not touch borders, that you do not violate borders, you cannot change borders by force in any possible way. And that principle is not violated for the first time, but it's violated in the most brutal way this time. And I think the significance of that cannot be underrated. Now, I think this is also a time, of course, for introspection for us as researchers in terms of what we have written about Russia's relation with the rest of Europe. It's a time for modesty, I think, also to be aware of the fact that there's many things we do not know and we cannot necessarily predict. And there's also now a lot of information that is lacking, in particular information on what exactly is going on behind the walls of the Kremlin. Yet, keeping this modesty in mind, or this attempt at modesty, I think there is in the current analysis, and maybe not in this room, but in the current analysis, there is far too much emphasis, I think, on spheres of influence, interest of great powers, balances of power, and this sort of thing. So it's very often the realist scheme that dominates. Again, maybe not in this room, but it is something that you hear in a lot of media analysis that is still very dominant as an approach. And I think we have to be careful. And of course, we can wonder why that is the case. Why is realism dominant? It's often the case whenever there's a war that realism comes up as the most impressive scheme to explain things. Yeah, as a colleague put it, when shit hits the fan, realism is always right. And this is what we're confronted with. And this is one of the things we have to think about, yeah, to what extent it is given. And I got a question from students several times already. Does this now prove that realism is right? Yeah, because there's a war going on. So let's be careful with this explanation, because I think these schemes in terms of spheres of influence and interest and power and so on are far too simplistic. And if you have listened to the speech that Putin gave on the 21st of February, it's actually really surprising that we still think in these terms. This was a speech a couple of days before the invasion in which he talked, I think, for about 20 minutes, basically about the fact that Ukraine had no right to exist. In a very selective reading of history, in a very biased way, of course, with a very clear message. But it was no longer about the discourse that had been dominant over the previous year, which was a discourse about NATO enlargement and Russian security concerns and so on. Yeah? So it's actually surprising that a lot of the analysis ignores not just this one speech. There was also a speech by Lavrov. Putin spoke a second time on the 24th of February. There was his article last summer about Ukraine and so on and so on. So in other words, I think there is a huge disconnect between the Russian discourse about NATO enlargement and how the West is posing a threat and what is going on today. And there's also a huge disproportionality. Yeah, because Trenin, for example, one of the leading Russian foreign policy analysts, said a couple of days before the war started in an interview that actually NATO enlargement is not a very big threat to Russia. As long as the deterrence balance is kept, he said, it's not a major threat. So there is a huge disconnect, disproportionality between this Russian discourse on its security concerns over the Western track, NATO enlargement, and so on, and the type of war they are fighting, the fact that they fought a war on 3 fronts, that it's clearly aimed at territorial expansion, and also the brutality with which they are fighting it. And I think you could actually say that Russia's security problems have all become worse as a result of the current war. NATO will be expanding, most likely with Finland and Sweden. We see increased military spending. We see United Transatlantic Front. We see Germany going through its historical shift. It has already been mentioned, but that's a key factor because the whole idea of security in Europe was very much based on the idea of reconciliation between Germany and Russia. And that is now disappearing. Germany takes a totally different position, despite the ambiguities that may exist. And I think that's a major new fact and turning point as such. Russia may be uncertain about the future with its own partners. It may be driven further into isolation. It will very much depend on what China will do, of course. But on top of that, Russia is seen now, I think, by a majority of countries in Europe, even the ones that do not say it aloud, as the major security problem. Yeah? And there's no doubt about that anymore. There's almost a consensus on that, with a couple of exceptions in terms of countries within Europe. So you can actually wonder whether Putin's discourse on NATO enlargement was not a distraction or a pretext for the invasion. And in particular, if you take into account that the offer was made to Ukraine to join NATO in 2008, that is 14 years ago. And it was not on the agenda. It was not going to happen anytime soon. And nobody in Russia believed that it would happen anytime soon. So invading 14 years after the offer has been made is a little bit of a disconnect. So I think the war we're facing today is not the result of an escalation of tensions with the West. And I must admit I was wrong on that myself. So speaking about this attempt at modesty, I had expected that we could see an escalation of events. Yeah, that's not what happened. I think this is really a war that was, as it is often said, unprovoked. Yeah? It is also not a direct escalation of the war that was already raging in eastern Ukraine since 2014, but it is clearly about a denial of Ukraine's right to exist. It's an attempt at territorial expansion. I don't think there can be any doubt about that. And therefore, I think to understand what is going on, we need to understand better the domestic processes within Russia. And I would like to mention two things without wanting to be exhaustive. First is that we may not always have understood very well the perceptions that existed in Russia, in particular since 2014, after the Ukraine crisis started, where Russia felt that what had happened, what they saw as the loss of Ukraine to the West, that this was very much a sort of existential crisis for them. Yeah? That is sort of brought back debates that were not new, but they got a new boost. Debates on Russia's identity and whether Russia can exist within its own borders and whether Russia is not naturally connected to countries like Ukraine. So it was a debate that was about identity. Yeah? And there very much it is about Russia still struggling with its imperial past, Russia not accepting to live within the borders it has existed in since the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it's at the same time about geopolitics. It's about the idea that has been mentioned, I believe, yesterday, Brzezinski's idea that Ukraine is crucial for the great power status of Russia. And what is unique, I think, about the Russian debate is that you have this mixture of this identity argument that is very much within imperial mindset, imperialist mindset, and this geopolitical argument about great powerness and Russia's entitlement to great powerness. And you've seen that in debates that have flared up since 2014 in Russia around the idea of the Russian island, the idea of Tsimbursky, for example, about the idea of national loneliness or a fortress of solitude, terms that were very popular in intellectual debates in Russia. And that always referred to the same idea that Ukraine, but also Belarus, naturally belong to Russia, that they form one people, that these are actually Russian lands, or the idea of a unique civilization, yeah, that Russia stands for a civilization and Ukraine and Belarus are fully part of that. But of course, the way in which this has been translated politically took very different forms. Yeah? Some pleading for a sort of neutral, demilitarized zone in Ukraine and Belarus, others pleading for territorial expansion in a very simple and straightforward way. And where you can see the mix very well of this geopolitical argument and its identity argument is in the work of Mezuyev, for example, who has launched at some point is what he calls an international relations theory, but I don't think it lives up to the standards really, which he calls civilizational realism, the idea that Russia is actually the leader of a civilization as such, and he thinks in very realist terms about how Russia can fulfill this great power role as a civilization vis-a-vis the West. So that's one element. The second element is about the fact that Russia's policy in Ukraine or vis-a-vis Ukraine or in Eastern Ukraine after 2014 has not been very successful, and that there has been an increasing frustration in Russia. And many Russian analysts have written for years about the fact that the Kremlin wanted to find a more permanent solution for what they saw as the stalemate in Eastern Ukraine. There was a lack of clarity of objectives. There was not a very coherent policy. Okay, you had these two people's republics in the east of Ukraine, but what did Russia really want to achieve with that in the longer term? So there was this increasing frustration over the lack of perspective, lack of coherence, lack of objectives for this particular policy. And this has led to a centralization of Ukraine policy of Russia under Dmitry Kozak in particular, but it has also arguably led to a sort of radicalization of scenarios. Yeah, because I think the original strategy of Russia was about weakening Ukraine, destabilizing Ukraine by enforcing federalization upon Ukraine through economic sanctions. Yeah, but when all these measures did not really work, did not lead to the expected results, we saw that Russia slowly started to radicalize its policy towards covert operations, trying to overthrow the government, and ultimately ending up with what you could say the ultimate extreme scenario, invasion and occupation. I don't think we have enough information to really draw the scenario of how that went, but I think there are many arguments to say that we saw a sort of tunnel vision, a radicalization of scenarios trying to achieve something in Ukraine that didn't work with previous policies. And I think in general, what we see here is a fundamentally new Russian strategy. From a strategy that was aimed at destabilizing Ukraine, I think that was the main purpose, in particular of keeping or supporting the People's Republics of Lugansk and Donetsk, keeping a foot in the door, deterring NATO expansion, but also what you could call punching above its weight. I think Russia tried to achieve maximal results with minimal means for many years. And the sort of silent takeover of Crimea, annexation by surprise, was very much part of that. Russia invested very little to get quite maximal results, the full control over the Crimean Peninsula. Now in the new strategy, this is totally different, because now it's about, as I said, denying Ukraine's sovereign right to exist. It's about a policy of territorial expansion. It's about a massive use of force. It's about a full-scale war. So it's no longer about minimal means to achieve maximum effects, punching above its weight, but now it's really about using maximal means, trying to achieve maximal effects, and we'll have to see whether that will work out or not. It certainly doesn't go as smoothly as hoped for. I'm probably already at my 10 minutes because I forgot when I started, but let me just add one. Yeah, let me just add one or two points, in particular to feed back to the European post-Cold War order. I think this is a turning point in the sense that this is clearly the final end of the European post-Cold War security order. Now, the patient was already ailing. It was already in a very deep crisis. And I think there are different reasons why you can see that. We didn't have a collective security system that worked. There was no longer indivisibility of security as pledged once upon a time in the Paris Charter, as one of the basic principles of the new post-Cold War security order. Almost all arms control treaties, except the New START agreements, have collapsed. And it's actually amazing how few researchers work on that, because this has a tremendous importance. And of course, the border regime had been already under pressure, and the annexation of Crimea was already a very serious violation of the European border regime. But now we face the total collapse, which means there's basically nothing left to talk about, to negotiate about. There's no common ground, no common principle on the basis of which Russia and the EU, Russia and the West can go and talk about the new security order. There's simply nothing there. What is interesting about that is that agency has entirely shifted to Ukraine. Remember how it was before the 24th of February? Everybody was talking about how the US and Russia could maybe find an agreement over the heads of Ukraine, or the heads of the Ukrainians. Now this is no longer the case. Now the Americans have clearly said this is a regional war, we're not party to that. So now it's up to Ukraine basically to decide what they want to do, whether they want to negotiate, what they want to achieve, whether they're willing to make concessions. So agency has sort of returned to Ukraine, you could say. At the same time, I think that this collapse of the European post-Cold War order has certainly not caused the current war, but has facilitated it in some ways. And that is, for example, the case if you look at the CFE treaty, the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe, that collapsed already quite some years ago. One of the basic principles there was to avoid a sort of blitzkrieg. And it had a ban, for example, on the possibility to concentrate troops on the border of other countries. So what Russia did over the last year, concentrating, mobilizing troops on the border with Ukraine, would have been impossible under the CFE treaty if it would still have been in existence. That would not necessarily have stopped them, but at least it would have sent clear signals about what was going on. Or the fact that Russia is now using this hypersonic missile was an answer to the American defense shield, for which George W. Bush withdrew from the ABM treaty. So everything is somehow connected. And again, this is not saying that this caused the war, absolutely not, but it's something that facilitated at least the invasion and the possibility of a war. To conclude, the impact on the European Union, sorry for taking so long, is that also for the EU, there's only one possibility, that is confrontation with Russia for the time being, for the time to come. I think there's very little in the current situation that is possible. And what is interesting is that the EU got its act together in many ways with the sanction packages, and managed to do something that was even unthinkable, that is sort of reversing the dependency in the energy field. For many years, the discussion was always about how Russia was holding the EU in a stranglehold because they were so dependent on energy. Now it's the EU that seized the initiative to a large extent and basically took measures to reduce the dependency on Russian gas and oil. It will no doubt mean the end of the Eastern Partnership in its current form, because there's little left and the strategic context will be totally different. And there is, of course, a window of opportunity for a European security and defense policy. And Macron, of course, took that opportunity with the Versailles Declaration. But I think we should not be too optimistic about that, because whatever the EU will do, it will always be in some sort of co-opetition with NATO, in cooperation and in competition with NATO. And whenever we would ever go back to negotiating a European security order, it will be about arms control treaties. So it will be in the first place between the US and Russia, and the EU will be doomed anyway to play a secondary role in this. Rodana's conclusion, not too much room for optimism, but I think it's probably useless to add that point. So let me rest my case here. Thank you.
Well, we can move on to Olga then. The agency is all in the hands of Ukraine now. That's a good transition to your presentation, I think.
Thank you. I have actually prepared slides, and that's mostly for my benefit because I feel like I've been given a talk on what's going on for the past 3 months and something. So I have like one big talk in my head, and I was like, okay, I need to pick a few points I want to make today, and I need slides to keep me on track. And I also really wanted to share, I think this is the first panel in 3 months, the first lineup in 3 months where I did not have a silent tantrum listening to other speakers. I was actually nodding and agreeing and really like, oh, I don't have to say this anymore. Melton said it. I don't need to say this. Don't already said it. Like, and I don't know what Gergana has to say, but I know Gergana, so I know I'm safe there too. So I'm in a very happy place right now to be speaking. Now, what I want to say, I don't know if it's so much about turning point for Europe. What I wanted to focus on is about how this is a turning point for our discipline, our profession, our communities, academia, because there's so much debate, there's so much being said, and so much, nonsense being proliferated, and there's so much complicity and ignorance that is now coming to the fore that I think we really are living through a momentum for. It's a window of opportunity. It's a critical juncture. We might get off the path or not, but this will really be a window, an opportunity for decolonizing IR, decolonizing EU studies, and all those things. So I tried to capture it in the title here, like on the EU, Russia's war against Ukraine and epistemic imperialism. And this is not based on a paper, but in a way it is based on a paper because I am co-authoring a paper on the colonial feminist critique of the debate and all the nonsense that we have to seek through as we are reading, right? First point, I wanted to start here. I have this title, Ms. Bublyuk, Ukrainian political scientist. This is how I am introduced 99 times out of 100. And I think the Miss will ring a bell with every woman in the room, and the Ukrainian will ring a bell with every Eastern European in the room.
Turks as well.
Well, right. So everybody from European peripheries or global south, or you can include European peripheries in the global south. It depends how broad the definition is. And this is kind of somehow meant, I will not focus on the sexism, on the Miss or Mrs., but really on the politics of knowledge production, politics of expertise, positionality, and how when Ukrainian is emphasized, I'm suddenly holding the banner for my people. So I'm no longer just the scientist in the room. I'm also, or scholar of Ukraine. I'm a Ukrainian scholar. So I somehow represent the people, and I'm essentially flawed and biased and emotional and subjective. So nothing I have to say actually has any legitimacy. So it's really funny because this is said like, oh, she's actually Ukrainian. She can read Ukrainian. She knows primary sources. She knows the people. But by saying that, that also kind of discredits me and what I have to say. I'm really happy to share that I will be actually co-editing a special forum on this with the Journal of International Relations and Development, specifically picking up on this, and we want to pull all the things that there are to say, right? And also people usually ask, how are you doing? And I answer, how long have you got? And the short answer is I just sent, if it's via chat or email, I just sent a link to a song by a Ukrainian band Kaska, which is titled I'm Not Okay. And it's a song she released in the first weeks of the war with really powerful footage. So I'm like, I'm not okay, end of discussion. But yeah, moving on. Another point that I really think is important to say is that there's somehow, okay, not in this room, not in our conversation and this conference, but generally out there, but even to some extent here, and even I am sometimes also guilty of this. There is the one who shall not be named in the debate. Who do you think I'm referring to?
Misha,
okay. He's the one who should not be mentioned, right? Who should be forgotten, right? Now, I actually mean Russia here, because for the longest time, it's missing from the label of the events, because we're talking about the Ukraine crisis, and that for the longest time, right, implying that somehow there's either crisis in Ukraine or Ukraine is the crisis, or there is a crisis over Ukraine. We're talking about Ukraine conflict, again, implying that this is somehow domestically grown internal problem, internal conflict within Ukraine. And other parties might have a stake, but the conflict is essentially, in Ukraine. We've been talking about Donbass war, again, ignoring the fact that the bigger agenda behind the whole thing was to make Ukraine incapable, unable, unfunctional as a sovereign state on the international arena, as Tom has wonderfully put. We talk about, okay, now we've upgraded, we talk about Ukraine war. Again, like, I'm missing the point. Is the war over Ukraine? Is the war in Ukraine? Who's fighting? Who started the war? Who's fighting? What are the parties? War in Ukraine. Again, Russia is, he who should not be named, she who should not be named, right? Because in Russian is a female gender word, right? Okay, at some point we admit, okay, it's Putin's war. Okay, we are willing to admit who's the initiator, but we're going to just blame it on one man because it's too painful to admit that there's actually a regime, a government, and a population behind the one man, right? So we talk about Putin's war, still somehow like, okay, we just need to get rid of Putin, and then, this is over. No need to ever open the, the box of Russia. And how did this ever become possible? Ukraine-Russia war, fantastic. So Ukraine and Russia are fighting each other, right? So they're bombing each other, they've invaded each other, or maybe there's a little island in the Black Sea that they're fighting over, or maybe there is a island in the Pacific that they both want to have, right? So again, it's like they are fighting each other on equal terms, rather than one has invaded the other, and the fighting happens entirely on the territory of that country that's defending. Russia's war in Ukraine, already much better, but still, who is Russia fighting in Ukraine, right? Is it fighting forest fires? Russia's invasion of Ukraine, also much better, but it has somehow a static feel to it. Like you've invaded somewhere, not like you've bombed all of the country on one morning, right? So it has some sense of locality and kind of ad hoc and finite thing, like you've invaded and stopped or something. So I think something's still missing. Russia's war on Ukraine, I believe this is how this event is called. So that's already a fantastic formulation. And the favorite one, and the one that's used consistently now in Ukraine's discourse, is Russia's war against Ukraine. Only just to give you an idea, words Putin and Russia are most often spelled in low letter in Ukrainian media. They're no longer capitalized, even just as a sign of disrespect. But basically, the bigger problem behind it is that there is somehow a false assumption or an implication that, Ukraine is the problem to be solved, that the solution lies with Ukraine, and therefore, like, it's still early February, there was this big talk at the UVA about the Ukraine crisis. I'm like, guys, this is not the Ukraine crisis, this is the Russia crisis. Russia might start the war, and we need to be talking what to do about Russia, not what to do about Ukraine. And there were literally people on the panel showing slides on public opinion about gay marriage in Ukraine. Like, how is this relevant to the conversation? How is this even part of anything? And then, like, the question for me, like, I've just been seeing this happen, like, exactly how scared of Russia is everyone? Politicians, heads of states, but also policy analysts, journalists, us academics, like, why will we not call it, even not call the events? Or are we so, like, in the narrative that we, can no longer see? And like I said, I'm sometimes also complicit. I say, like, oh yeah, there's a conference on the war in Ukraine, or, like, I will use the same terms, right? So yeah, defining the problem is essential, and I'm really grateful to other speakers earlier just now, but also earlier today and yesterday for already picking up on many of this. It's not about Ukraine's internal problems. Ironically, the week of the invasion, of the escalation, I was actually on board of a project about democratic innovations in non-Western democracies, and I was writing for Ukraine and all the fantastic things in Ukraine that the West should learn from to reinvigorate citizen participation and democracy in the West, right? So again, going back to Ukraine crisis thing, it's not about Putin suddenly losing his mind. Anybody who's followed knows that this has been systematically premeditated for the past 20, 25 years. It's already been done in Russia first, in Chechnya, Dagestan, Ossetia, Tatarstan, Turkmenistan, sorry, Turkmenistan, separate country, Buryatia, many regions within the Russian Federation. It's been done to Georgia, to Ukraine before. It's been being done for 8 years. Syria, we can bring in African continent, etc. I'm a little less versed in those, so I'm afraid to use examples, but you know, this has been going on, and it's been a dictatorial regime for a while. It's not about NATO expansion. If anything, NATO did not expand, and that's the problem. Ukraine asked, please take us in, and NATO said no. And Putin said, George, Ukraine's not even a country. It's a famous quote from 2008. And 2 months later, Russia invaded Georgia, right? And just a few years later, Russia annexed Crimea. And I have this, I'm now working, I'm a lawyer by training, and we had this method of arguing in a criminal trial to turn things absurd, to stretch the argument to the point of the absurd. And I've been using this, and it's not even so absurd. I'm like, if you want to use realist thinking, really make a geopolitical realist argument involving Russia and NATO, it should be Russia should have joined NATO to protect itself from China. That's the only geopolitical realist assessment. If you look at geo as the globe, and you know where the threat lies and where the protection lies and where the biggest border of Russia is and where most money, power, and people are to potentially, and who is actually quietly invading Russia along the Siberian borders, Russia should have joined NATO and not, you know, antagonized. It's not about denazifying, not about Russian speakers and all. It is about Russian imperialism and Russian identity. And Tom has already made a fantastic point about that just earlier. In Ukraine, there is this going joke. You just need to change the number, right? So every time I talk, I need to Google which day of the war it is, so I can update. So today we would say this is the 98th day of a 3-day special operation in an 8-year-long war that lasts for several centuries. I'm not a historian, but I've read history books, and since 1667 at least, Muscovy and then Russian Empire and then Soviet Union and now Russian Federation are systematically erasing and denying statehood, nationhood, language, and culture, with up to 100 laws forbidding Ukrainian language in different times, and so on and so forth, right? So this is, again, this is nothing new. This is not about NATO or West. Okay, those things all play in and are being used as narrative argument, discourse argument, and maybe side agendas, secondary agendas, but this is not what the war really is about. And a good quote, I cannot find the original source, is that, you know, without Russia in this war, there would be no war. Without Ukraine in this war, there would be no Ukraine. Again, speaking about the response of the world and what kind of scenarios the world would really be okay with. Well, we saw that very well in 2014. It was fine for the world. You know, we'll just put nominal sanctions in place and say it's a done deal. Russia's never giving Crimea back, so we might as well call it a done deal. And in Ukraine, in the first days of the war, it was really like, the more hours we stand, the better, because if we fall too quickly, the West will not even have to respond. Like, it takes 3 days to congregate a summit, so we need to stand at least 3 days so that the EU leaders have to fly in and take a decision, and they cannot like say, sorry, Russia already took Ukraine, it's never giving it back, so let's just see how we deal with the new status quo, right? So this is very much also an understanding in Ukraine. Now, another thing I wanted to make, just again thinking back on like what an unfortunate place to be, kind of Ukraine is. And I got the best metaphor from a fantastic TV show, Atypical. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's on Netflix, but probably on other platforms as well, about the family with a boy who has autism and how it affects all members. But the main character, Sam, he's obsessed with penguins, and he goes to college and he takes an art class, and his professor says, you have to portray the essence of the penguin. And he's walking around obsessed for a few episodes. What's the essence of the penguin? And then he realized that the essence of a penguin is that it lives in brutal atmospheric conditions and still stays there. And I was like, hit pause. And my husband's like, I need to know this down. Ukraine lives in brutal geopolitical conditions, and the essence of Ukraine is that it stays. And there's this other quote by a Ukrainian writer, still from early 2000s, because he was challenged, oh, you're like a Ukrainian writer, you say there's a Ukrainian nation, but there is not a Ukrainian national idea. And he said, it's Les Podorevyansky, he's known for using obscene language, so forgive me, I'm quoting. He said, there is a national idea, and it is fuck off, right? That the whole history of Ukraine nation is about getting, defending itself from external occupiers who want something from it, right? And if we look at it as today, it's not so much a clash of civilization and Ukraine lying, on the kind of crack line between the civilizations. It's about clash of empires and clash of imperialisms, even where the empires are technically gone, right? And that's what we're writing about in that paper with 3 scholars who are actually doing post-colonial, they're scholars of post-colonialism, decolonialism, and we're like bringing that together to butcher the IR debate. There's Russian imperialism towards Ukraine, primarily, but there's also Western imperialism towards Ukraine. Just the fact that Macron is calling Putin to discuss what to do with Ukraine, like, excuse me, like, would Macron be calling Putin about what to do with Germany, without Germany part of the call or whatever, make any other, replace the names of put any other country in the place of Ukraine and imagine if that would be happening. But there's also Western imperialism towards Russia, which is also in all these arguments, oh, the West provoked. I'm like, oh my God, the West has such a deep sense of superiority. It cannot even admit that Russia has the agency to act. It has to be react. It has to be in reaction to something the West did first. So it's always up to or down to the West, right? And there's like a third thread, which is kind of a little less, but is already being picked up by scholars specifically from Central Eastern Europe, countries other than Ukraine, in terms of their imperialism towards Ukraine, right? The Polish-Lithuanian kingdom, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and all these dynamics that are now revived and kicked in these countries supporting Ukraine or supporting Ukrainian refugees, what is really the motivation and their rationale. And again, bottom line is academia is very much complicit in this. And I'm sometimes asked by journalists, oh, the invasion happened and nobody saw it coming. How come? I'm like, that's a very good question. Like, we failed, like if we didn't see it coming, we failed. And not only in seeing it coming, but in listening to those who were saying, it's coming, attention, it's coming. And Ukrainian scholars in particular have been saying, for 8 years, it's already happening. This is already a war. It never really froze. I mean, it was always active, the war in the East, and people were dying every day. I have 1 minute left, so I'll just skip this part. And I think this is what you guys know most about. But in terms of reactions, there are basically 2 general clubs, the realists, the offensive realists, the defensive realists, who say it's a done deal. Russia's got more tanks and more soldiers. Ukraine's only got a few hours left. There's no way, Ukraine's going to win this. So why don't they just surrender? Why don't you just seize some territories and freeze this? Again, missing the point entirely that this war is about destroying Ukraine. So nothing short of that would be a solution. It will just be step 1, step 2, step 3, and then it's a matter of time when the next step happens. On the other side, you have the leftists, the feminists, who say, stop resisting, stop violence. Let's not send Ukraine arms because then it will be defending for longer. It's going to lose anyway, but then it will be defending longer, so more people will die. Again, or stop it, save women, again, ignoring the fact the empirical evidence from the occupied territories and of what happens there, right? And just, if you think you know, you don't know. It's so awful that I don't watch the news anymore. It's like, it's awful, right? And now the new argument, so like Ukrainian community, Central East European feminists already replied, this is bullshit, this is not a feminist argument, this is bullshit, this is not a ethical pacifist argument, etc. The new thing is now, stop resisting because we need the grain to feed Africa and Middle East. Again, he who shall not be named, these arguments are not addressed at Russia, stop fighting Ukraine, there's going to be global hunger. It's Ukraine, stop resisting, there's going to be global hunger. Ignoring the fact that Russia's stealing the grain, destroying the grain, and things like that. So yeah. Where is the West in all this? My general sense is that the West is really trying to go back to February 23rd, when Russia was sort of okay, Ukraine was sort of not in trouble, and we could, pump oil, do business, and pretend nothing bad is happening. But I hate to disappoint you, it's not going to happen because Ukraine will never surrender. at this point. And again, an important factor that everybody ignores is that Ukraine is a democracy and that Ukrainian population has experience of resistance. And now for the first time ever, it's armed population, right? So Ukraine did away with the government in 2004, just with Molotov cocktails in 2014, with Molotov cocktails. Now we have millions of people armed. So if now even Zelensky would go and sign peace accord with Russia ceding territories, tomorrow Zelensky is gone, right? People would put new government and fight partisan war until the last drop. East-West divide, I leave it to that. And just, I'm promoting Eurovision as a research subject because I think scientifically there's a lot of potential if you go from IR and do everyday geopolitics, political science, you look at consumer nationalism, banal nationalism, how countries represent themselves and how people vote. European studies, everyday Europeanization and perform in Europe, Eurovision as a site to perform in Europe. And finally, in terms of EU studies and EU response, what is the actual link between the elites and the population? And what is maybe the democratic deficit, and how can we see the popular opinion manifested in other arenas? Thank you very much. I hope this was not too long, probably by a minute. So, and I will now stop sharing.
Thank you, Olga. We move on to Gergana's presentation.
Okay. Oops. Thank you very much. I am probably equally guilty of being biased, Ola, because I am Eastern European, so keep that in mind. I'm going to talk about EU enlargement. So you're going to say this is a topic that's not for the Eastern Europeans to talk about, right? But we've been hearing about, we've been dismissed about what we think about Russia for a very, very long time. Now we've been proven right by events, so perhaps, don't worry about being discredited, you have something to say. Now, the question I want to ask is this a turning point for EU's enlargement policy? And I want to make the argument that it should be. We don't know whether it is going to happen. We will know the answer by June, probably by the end of the month. But, I want to make the argument that it should be a turning point for EU's enlargement policy, because what we have seen, what the invasion has shown is the inadequacies of at least two EU policies. One is the EU's enlargement policy, and the other is the European neighbourhood policy, or at least the Eastern dimension of the European neighbourhood policy. And for 2 decades, right, the EU has been constructing its political geography in these two policy frameworks. One is, and these both, the enlargement policy for the Western Balkans and sort of the ENP for the Eastern dimension, or the Eastern partners, while both these regions, sub-regions, they are part of the bigger sort of post-communist space. And for anyone that knows a bit about these countries, this is a very, very odd and strange division, right? But nevertheless, the EU has been, participating, in this sort of division, construction of this division, of this mapping of the region, which is entirely detached from the realities on the ground, right? And I'm going to give two sort of short examples here why this is inadequate. Now, if you compare the democracy trajectories, the democratization trajectories of the Western Balkan countries and of the countries from the Eastern Partnership, in particular those who are the willing reformers from the Eastern Partnership, the ones that have signed association agreements with the EU, or the 3 DCFTA countries, if you compare the democratization trajectories of these two groups, you will see that the Western Balkans are firmly sort of on the de-democratization trajectory. So not only they are not improving, they're going backwards. Now, the ones, the Eastern Partnership, the DCFTA countries, they have gone through, a lot of ups and downs. But if you take a longer term perspective, right, they are clearly on an improvement trajectory. And if you compare, if you take a snapshot today, Actually, Moldova and Georgia are ahead of any of the Western Balkan countries in terms of democracy ranking. Okay, that's one argument, right? And the enlargement policy is supposed to be that drive of democratization that has never actually happened, that has never materialized. If you compare these two groups on how they measure in terms of approximation with EU acquis, you will be surprised to find out that the DCFTA countries are ahead of the Western Balkan countries. This has something to do with the specificities of these two policies. Now, in the enlargement policy, to open a chapter of the EU acquis, you need unanimity. And there has to be, the member states have to decide, and this is always a political process. So these countries are not really encouraged to approximate legislation, even if they can and want to. With the DCFTA countries, the methodology was very different. Sort of the menu of the acquis was opened immediately, and they were asked, pick and choose. And, you know, the ones that were ambitious, they actually did the work. And if you compare the record today, they are actually legally more aligned with the EU than the future member states from the Western Balkans, right? So there's clearly the security situation in the moment in the two regions is very different, but it is very, very unfortunate that it takes a war for the EU to see that its policies are inadequate and they need change, right? And so what should that change be? And here the question is, can this taboo of, you know, no accession to Ukraine and to Georgia and Moldova, should this taboo fall? And should the EU promise accession, conditional accession, long-term, symbolic at this point? And here, again, I want to make the comparison with the Western Balkans. I remember very well the debates at the time when the EU decided to extend the membership perspective for the Western Balkans. This was in the year 2000, it's 20 years ago, 22 years ago, time flies. So back then there were two arguments, right? There was the identity argument and there was the security argument. The identity argument was never important in these decisions, right? It has always been about security. But from an identity point of view, it was very odd why Bulgaria and Romania, who are Balkan countries, are members who have the perspective to join the EU at the time, and the rest of the Balkans are not, right? From an identity perspective, you know, this is not, there's no strong identity argument here. From a security perspective, and the security perspective prevailed at the time, right? The member states at the time said the only way to get security in the region is through democratizing the region and making the region part of the family. Okay. Now, if you apply the same two arguments to the current situation, I think they are applicable in a similar way. Okay, from an identity point of view, it is unexplainable why Ukraine cannot be an EU candidate and Serbia is, or any country from the Western Balkans is, or the Western Balkans is. From a security perspective, right, I don't think the EU security doctrine has changed on that very premise, right? That the sort of the best way to securitize the region in a way, to pacify the region and to make it a secure region for the EU's own sake is by democratizing it. And actually by democratizing it, you also crowd out Russian influence, right? And so not only, you know, at sort of the security level, I mean, if you clean corruption, right, in these countries, you're actually, you know, crowding out Russian influence because a lot of the big political corruption is in the big energy projects, right? And so I'm personally very happy as a citizen at the moment that we are stopping gas from Russia. And I see in this an opportunity, a democratization opportunity for my own country, right? And I think similar dynamics can play out in these other countries. So from both perspectives, I think it's the right moment for a turning point. And I very much hope that the leaders will rise to the occasion at the end of June and will take now the right decisions. Now, there's only one final point I'd like to make, and I'm stopping there. Now, is the current enlargement policy fit for purpose, right? That's the other big question. Okay, even if that decision is made, I mean, can it work? Has it worked so far? And, you know, the record isn't very positive, right? If you look at it, the Western Balkan countries who are candidates, right? They are de-democratizing, right? The statehood issues that are there are not resolved, right? We still have the Kosovo issue lingering. Bosnia is going backward. Russia is back in town. China is making inroads. You know, North Macedonia is permanently blocked, right? And continues to be so by my own country at the moment for all crazy and reasons. But this sort of long-term prospect, accession prospect, has stopped being a driver of positive change, is very distant as a prospect, is not credible at all. So something has to change. Clearly, the current policy isn't delivering. And there are various ideas here of what could be done. They've been coined in the policy environment. In the policy circles, there's a lot of ideas about staged membership, phasing in benefits of integration. And a lot of strategic thinking has to go there, no doubt. But probably the most important is to slice up the process into shorter periods, right? That are more tangible, more feasible, slice up the carrot into smaller and attractive pieces, right? And slice up also the conditions attached to the small pieces of the carrot, right? So that it becomes a little bit more real for these countries that, you know, if they progress in the right direction, they'll join the family. And there's a lot of other questions about what should we do about the ENP, but I will leave this for the Q&A and for others who are also experts on that, by the way, on the panel. So this is just, I'll stop here and, you know, plenty of food for thought.
Thank you very much to all the speakers. As Gergana said, we have a lot of food for thought here and a lot of things to discuss. I think perhaps I will just flag two common themes or responses to the theme of the workshop, of the roundtable that I heard in all presentations with regard to whether or not this is a turning point. There seems to be a consensus that yes, although Meltem was more hesitant in terms of suggesting, well, there are some long-term challenges that have been amplified. In a sense, this was also reflected in the other presentations, because you all seem to say it's a turning point, but it's also a situation in which we need to rethink. So it's, in a sense, opportunity is a very bad choice of words in this context. An obligation, perhaps, to rethink, but not only for the European Union. Perhaps also you have flagged this could be a turning point for scholarship, for the theories and concepts and words that we use in order to analyze European politics, and again, an opportunity to rethink. I think wherever I look in my own country at the moment, I am told that we are facing the return to realpolitik. What I heard in this panel was something very different, that we should not return to realpolitik. And even if a lot of people in my sort of daily environment dislike Mearsheimer, they keep arguing that we are returning to a geopolitical world. So that makes me perhaps want to throw in an additional question in terms of this question, last part of rethinking scholarship, which is, do we have the adequate conceptual and analytical tools to do that rethinking? If we do, what are they? Thomas pointed to one important avenue of taking domestic politics more seriously. That's one way. In the previous session, we also talked about the sort of the interrelationship between the domestic and the external, and the need to sort of move beyond this idea of state boundaries, that there are some societal challenges that actually travel across Europe that we also need to be conscious about when we study politics in the European Union. So, as it's common to say, theories are not only of the world, but they are in the world. So we also need to take that last part of how to rethink scholarship quite seriously. And I think I'll just, with that, open for comments and questions from the audience. Yes.
Thanks very much. I wanted to touch on the epistemic part of your paper. And, you know, thinking about Macron's telephone calls, you know, similarly, you wouldn't, American scholars who work on the US, there's not this inherent idea, oh, they must be biased because they're writing about their own country, right? So the question, I guess, that I would like to ask is, do you see this, do you see a change there now? And if so, I'm already a bit pessimistic perhaps, but if so, do you think this is a lasting change? And then I'm asking, I guess, everybody who cares to answer the really unfair question about what you think will happen to the Eastern Partnership. It's of course very open and kind of, you know, we don't know, but yeah, I would like to hear thoughts on it. Thanks.
Okay, perhaps we should collect a couple of more questions and then get back to the panel. Yes.
Yes, there are also two questions online.
Okay, so I need to.
And now also two questions from Sega.
Okay, shall I read the questions? They're quite long, but is the better historical parallel 1936 to 39? Yes, I think it was Malcolm who talked about parallels. Attempt to find a modus vivendi with authoritarian expansionist leaders with warnings of what was to come from Central and Eastern Europe and complacency from the core European governments. So maybe you take that.
So there's the last question.
Okay, so the second question is, do panelists have any comment on Bridget Laffan's thesis that the EU's response is grounded in a Draghi strategy of whatever it takes based on EU's innovative and ultimately successful strategies in response to Euro crisis and the pandemic? So I guess that would be a question for all the panelists. So whoever wants to pick that one up. And then Seda's question, she has two questions on enlargement. Is it possible to relaunch the enlargement agenda without solving the EU's internal problems? And what's next for Turkey-EU relations in light of Russia's war against Ukraine? So Meltem, you want to respond to that? And perhaps Gegana also might want to say something about enlargement and the implications for EU domestic politics. And if Tom and Olga want wants to say something about that, of course, they're welcome to do so as well. Are there any more hands here? Yes, lots of hands.
Maybe we shall pick up these 5 questions first and then.
Shall we do those first?
Yeah.
Perhaps we
Because
take
I will lose
Ingmar
the thread
as
for
well,
sure.
and then we move,
Oh,
so,
I didn't have a question, I was just wondering.
oh, okay, good. So we take these questions and then we take some more afterwards. Melton, do you?
Yeah, I'll answer mine. Okay, thank you. Now, the first point is, when Gergana was talking about enlargement, I think one of the things that we actually have to note is the fact that Turkey is also still officially a candidate country. And it's, while its negotiations are not going anywhere currently, it was declared, a candidate in 1999, that's about 4 years before the Western Balkan countries, and it still is on the paper. So whether, that ties back to Seda's question a little bit more, I don't think the war, the current, situation is going to increase the probability of the Turkish accession process. That's completely independent and separate from that. But I think it's unexpectedly creating something that's very interesting for me to observe, which is that it's making Turkish role in European security central back again. It's I was at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum at the beginning of March, and I was amazed by, this was where, the Ukrainian and Russian foreign ministers met for the first time after the, after the invasion of Ukraine. I can still say it, right?
Yes,
In that format. Okay. And the way that, everybody from the, highest ranking officials to the institutional representatives were there in Antalya trying to, get some kind of a sense of the situation, signaled to a certain extent or demonstrated to a certain extent that, Turkey plays still a central role it is contributing to the provision of a place for a dialogue. But that's not, that's completely independent of the Turkish accession process. So, Seda, to be very honest, I don't think the accession process is coming back. I think the EU and Turkey went to a completely different direction. It's just that politically, it doesn't make any sense for any party to say, well, it's dead and we're going to make a funeral for it. So everybody's pretending that it still is, more or less on the table, but it could come back. Because, for those of you who are talking and, researching on the connection between domestic and external and domestic and foreign politics interrelations. We have elections coming up next year in June 2023, if everything goes well. And if there is a governmental change in Turkey, I think the accession process could be very easily put back on track because, the public commitment and the institutional commitment among different governmental sectors is also very high to the EU accession goal. And I also see a very big parallel to, in answer to the first question, a very big parallel between what happened in the 30s in Western Europe and what is happening right now in Ukraine specifically. But I think, there is a going back to the geopolitical scene of the 1930s, yes. And I also think that there is a greater responsibility for the European Union to act much more decisively in a different fashion than it was able to do so before. So it might be a historic, I don't want to use opportunity, an historic turning point in terms of what Europe is going to evolve into as perhaps a security actor of some sort as well.
Thanks, Gergana, perhaps you want to follow because there was this issue of enlargement.
Yes, on internal reform and enlargement. So this is an old debate about deepening versus widening, right? We've been hearing it ever since enlargement policy has existed. And for me, whenever I hear this question, it always reminds me, okay, the widening camp wants to block enlargement, right? There's no reason why these two processes can go in parallel. And here we are not talking about these countries acceding tomorrow, right? But because they have quite some ground to cover at home. But it's very important that the right kind of messages are sent to them right away. because the narrative here matters, right? The way in which, you know, you sort of communicate, you know, the future of these countries, right? Whether they can have a future within you, it's important immediately, right? But, you know, the actual accession will not be for tomorrow for any of these countries. So I'm not so worried, right? Because the EU will have that time to sort out its internal affairs, right? Before, you know, ready for the next enlargement. Now, the other question is about the Eastern Partnership and what will happen. I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I had, but a lot, I think, will depend on what happens, on how this membership question is answered by the member states at the end of June. Now, if the answer is yes, you know, they are candidates, and in the long term, when they fulfill the conditions, they can become members, at least the 3 countries from the Eastern Partnership, that changes the game, right, for them. And that changes the game for the bilateral track of the Eastern Partnership. Now, the multilateral track, in my view, there's no reason why it can't stay, right? Because it's a regional, you know, process. It's about the process. It's not about, you know, concrete results. It's not about the end game either, right? It's a practical sectoral cooperation, right? And, you know, all of the current members of the Eastern Partnership have an interest in continuing with this multilateral dimension in the same way in which the Western Balkans have their regional initiatives as well. And that doesn't preclude them from having a bilateral relationship with the EU. So a lot of it will depend on that. But for the ENP, I think probably the disconnect between East and South is more pressing now, right? Because it's clear that, you know, it becomes very unbalanced.
Yeah, I want to pick up on a bunch of things, and I'll also get up because I feel like I sit not at the table but under the table. So standing will let me concentrate better. On historical parallels, I think it was the question from the chat, but a historical parallel I made for my students on the day of the invasion, because I had a class at 9 a.m. and I was like, what do I do? What do I do? I'll just teach the class. I said, guys, this is your 9/11 moment. You're watching, you know, world shift live on TV. Like whatever happens, whoever wins and however Europe responds to it, we were going to live in a different world. And I only got at that parallel because the week before I realized that my students who are now 20, 21, 22, they were either just born or not yet born at the day of 9/11, which I watched live on TV on the afternoon, having come home from school, right? So I think maybe there are definitely, you know, comparisons to be made to the earliest 20th century, but in terms of the turning point and the shifting of, you know, the world order, etc., maybe also a good parallel. And for us, it's in our lifespan, but for them, it's history. They need to read about the events. They don't have it in their memory. Maybe that could also be meant. On the prospect of membership for Ukraine, and of course, Moldova and Georgia jumped the same train quickly. I read a really good formulation by a colleague of mine from Ukraine, Katerina Zarembo. She said it's about survival and revival. It's not about Ukraine effectively joining the EU. And as we know from the Balkans, as we know from Turkey, you can have accessions forever, not leading anywhere, right? So in that sense, it's not at all even a binding decision. It could be taken purely for the symbolic political statement. And that statement would be that the EU believes that Ukraine will survive as a country, because for a country to join, for a state to join, you need to at least believe that there will be a state to join. And as a statement, an important political statement on Ukraine's revival, that once the war is over, Europe will work with Ukraine on reviving, because of course the destruction is enormous. And on top there's 45 million people with PTSD, right? So, I mean, the effects are going to be really long-term. Now, I wanted to go back to the question of Helena was asking, you know, an obligation to rethink how might we do it. And I was thinking for myself, first of all, go back to empirics. We're sometimes like, oh, we're so curious in this, you know, analytical arguments and the logic of the argument, and we sometimes just don't make the time for the empirics. And it's very important because I'm like, oh, we are surprised Ukraine's resisting. I'm like, why are you surprised? Like, what take any public opinion poll of February, a week before the invasion, there was a big public opinion poll where it said 2% of Ukrainians believed that there is a concession enough Ukraine could make to prevent Russia from invading. So a week before this, speaking of strategic surprise, well, my mother was strategically surprised. She started renovation the Monday, the week before. So when on Thursday, 5 cars of relatives were evacuating from Kyiv to my mom's hometown, she had no place to live. So she was strategically surprised, but in terms of that it would happen that week, she was maybe hoping to be done before spring when it is more likely to happen. But in terms of, whether Ukrainians believed any phone calls between German, French, and Russian leaders to make deals on or intervention of Biden or whatever would make any difference, the answer was no, because only 2% believe that, yeah, we can give them Crimea, we can give them Donbass, and that will stop anything, right? So empirics, another point is history. We have such a short span, like, oh, this is new, like, no, this has happened 10 years ago and 20 years ago and 50 years ago, and things are just repeating themselves. So sometimes we need a bigger outlook, and also in terms of going back to what we teach and how we teach, what we discussed this morning and also a little bit yesterday, it's our responsibility to know those things, and of course the burden is on us to know, but also on students to put those things in context and in perspective. And finally on listening to local voices and to disciplinary voices, because we have IR and we have area studies, and area studies is all the way at the bottom of IR. There are literally texts written about this. I can send it to the mail list. It's somewhere on my reading list, how area studies are completely, deprived of status, but they are there, and certain arguments. I mean, Ukrainian scholars have been writing about this for 10 years. Like, how is this novel? Well, nobody's been reading. And then ending with your question, yes, there is now suddenly interest, partly because there's interest, because people are now aware of their own ignorance, like, okay, like something's happening, doesn't make sense, doesn't fit what we thought we knew, so maybe there's something we don't know. So there's a huge demand, but I mean, to what extent is it opportunistic for the moment, like, oh, we need a Ukrainian on the panel to have a valid panel, I don't know if this will last, but this has to be just a shift in trend. I mean, it's not only Ukrainians. We need Central Asians to tell us about Central Asia and, this and that. And then I'm called by a journalist and they're like, oh, can we discuss the effects of the war on other post-Soviet countries? I'm like, okay, I'll email you a list of people I shall talk to. Talk to this person for Kazakhstan, to this person, like I shouldn't be commenting, about them. So yeah, I'll leave it as this.
Yeah.
So we can have more questions.
Okay, great. So, Tom, would you like to?
Thanks. We'd just like to pick up on 3 things. Let me start with the point that Olya made as well, that is about the empirics, going back to the empirics. And that includes, for example, domestic factors, very important. But as a person teaching international relations theories, I see a lot of recuperation efforts where people want to prove what's happening in Ukraine, want to prove their theory right, and use the Ukraine war or the war of Russia against Ukraine, to do that. Yeah, and I see that from all different corners, and I sometimes have very serious concerns how people may not see the brutality of the war just to recuperate their theory. Yeah? And one of the quotes I always start my international relations theory course with is a quote by Hannah Arendt, who said we have to be careful that because of our love of theories, we don't end up living in a defactualized world. Yeah? And I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. So just to echo what Olya said. On realpolitik, geopolitical world, I always have some trouble with this terminology, because what does it mean, geopolitics? And if you read the press, for example, geopolitics is used in so many different ways. It refers to everything. It's a container concept. It refers often simply to power. Yeah. And of course, there is much more awareness, and there will be probably a lot of awareness in terms of hard security interest and military expenditure and the destructive capacity of weapons for many years to come. Yes, but all these other things like identity issues and bias, cognitive bias, that is a very important factor to explain Russia's motivation, I think, will all continue to play a role. And in particular, uncertainty. And realpolitik always has this sort of suggestion that you have risks that you can calculate. Yeah. But what we are confronted with here in terms of strategic surprise, team power and all that is exactly that we have no idea. Yeah. We also have no idea where this will go. We have no idea that if there is an agreement between Ukraine and Russia at some point, what the next step will be. So realpolitik may not work very well because we have uncertainty, not simply risks that we can try to calculate. On the Eastern Partnership, just wanted to add one point very briefly to what Gergana already eloquently said, that is that if Ukraine gets membership status, it's in principle out of the Eastern Partnership, and then we're left basically with Georgia and Moldova. I don't think we should count Belarus and even Armenia and Azerbaijan very much as part of it. And it's interesting that even Georgia and Moldova now try to keep low profile, try to sort of emphasize their neutral status in one way or another, walk a tightrope, are in a very difficult position because they want to avoid they accept Russia too much, knowing that they may be next victim if they do so. And then on the parallel of the 1930s, we always have to be extremely careful with these sort of analogies, of course, and between Nazi Germany and Putin Russia or something. But one thing I found interesting in connecting it again to the way we use our theories is that I see that many academic colleagues sort of defend or find mitigating circumstances for Russia's war against Ukraine on the basis of Russia's security concerns, yeah? That Russia has forced for many years, NATO enlargement and so on and so on. But then I think if you make the parallel to the 1930s, yeah, you have some historians who make the claim that Nazism could grow on the basis of the fact that in the Versailles Treaty, Germany had been punished too harshly and that this was a sort of reaction against this humiliation of the Versailles Treaty. Now, this is discussed, this is disputed under historians, so it's not necessarily something we have to agree, but let's assume this is the case. Would that allow you to say that the invasion of Poland was therefore legitimate? That's a step we would never make. Nevertheless, I see many academic colleagues saying exactly that. Yeah? The invasion of Ukraine is sort of legitimate because of the security concerns, the enlargement of NATO. And I think that's a very dangerous step to make, real difficulties. And I'm surprised how often you hear that, that sort of claim.
Thanks a lot, Tom. So we have a second round of comments, and I noted some, but I'm not sure that I managed to note all the hands. Yes, so shall we start with you?
Yeah, sorry, I'm mindful of the time, so I'll try to be quite brief. Well, thanks, first of all, for the fascinating talk. You mentioned all of these references to the war that we make, Ukraine war and all of this. So there's another usual way to refer to it, which is a proxy war between Russia and the West, right? Which totally erases Ukraine.
And civil war, I forgot to mention.
And civil war,
Yes.
right.
That's my favorite.
So there is this kind of new narrative that the West is once again kind of involved in a new Cold War against Russia. It used to be China only 2 years back. Now it's again Russia. But we see that, I mean, obviously this new consensus emerging about the revitalization of NATO and how obviously Macron would no longer dare to say that it's brain dead anymore, right? So my concrete question would be, is this new narrative compatible in any way to the narrative about developing a European strategic autonomy? Or is this new focus on NATO incompatible with a purely European approach to approaching security and defense issues?
Yes.
Thank you. I'll ask a question to Tom. You mentioned that, I mean, you underlined the drawbacks of framing the conflict as a geopolitical conflict or a great power competition. So how would you frame the ongoing confrontation? And would you agree, because some of the other analysts are framing the conflict as an ideational struggle or civilizational struggle between the liberal democratic West and authoritarianist East? What are the, I mean, do you agree with such kind of a characterization? And the second, I asked to this question, everybody, to all the panelists. Yeah, in the short term, as far as I see, the Russian war in Ukraine has brought Atlantic and Europe together and underlined European dependency on the US when it comes to security. But how do you see in the long term, would the Russian war against Ukraine increase the demands for European strategic sovereignty or autonomy, or would it make Europe and Atlantic more closer? And what will be the implications, because the United States seems to be prioritizing Asia Pacific. So what will be the drawbacks of this increasing convergence between Europe and Atlantic?
Okay. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for your very good intervention. And I have a question for Olga. So you had this post-colonial demonstration about the way we talk about Ukraine crisis, the war, and Russia. And I was wondering, beyond the post-colonial critique, if you can go beyond and think about what does it mean for especially EU policymakers, EU academics, and how can these narratives, I think you're trying to debunk a little bit the one-size-fits-all of what's happening at the moment. And can you engage also with the decentering approach, maybe in EU foreign policy? I've been working with different colleagues where we try to think about how to reconstruct the practice of EU external action, which is also about mutual empowerment and mutuality and humility. And I think even here in this conversation, we talk a lot about the EU and Europe in a very Eurocentric way still as academics and policymakers. Of course, it's about European security, but we don't talk so much about Ukraine, I think. So how can we go beyond the critique, and how can we make sure that this plurality of narratives emerge and influence policymaking and diplomacy differently? Thank you. Did you? Yes.
Yeah. Thank you again for your amazing speeches. My name is Daniela, and I would like to ask one question about Turkey, since we didn't talk about today. Yes, Turkey took a bit awkward, it seems to me, role in this war. And as we already told, like Turkey's strategic partner of EU, but as I see now, it's a bit a kind of mismatch. So while West is putting sanctions on Russia, on Russian leaders, Turkey is doing something strange for me. For example, it's resisted joining these sanctions and still continues to import Russian soil. It's also kept the doors open for Russian travelers, and also hoping to encourage sanctioned Russian oligarchs. So don't you consider these sanctions to be a bit pointless if still Russian oligarchs who are sanctioned now are still can come to Turkey, and then from Turkey travel anywhere else, especially from Istanbul? It's like strategic point where you can fly anywhere else. And also, is it possible to encourage Turkey somehow to join the sanction instead of resist them? Thank you.
Thanks.
Actually, my question is also about sanctions, and the question is to Tom. We all mentioned that it's a turning point for the EU and for the EU enlargement policy, but I think it's also a turning point for EU sanction regime, because definitely the EU has never used so comprehensive sanctions in the whole post-Cold War period, as the EU was always well known for using targeted sanctions. Now with the sixth package of sanctions, we do know that they are also harming ordinary Russians, not only the political elites. However, do they indeed work? The purpose of the sanctions is always to change the behavior of the target, but Putin is still waging a full-scale war in Ukraine. It's not stopping him. So, and sanctions also didn't stop him in 2014, it only delayed. Right, so this is definitely a challenge for the EU scholarship studying sanctions, whether sanctions alone work. Right, this is a new turning point for EU sanction regime.
I also saw Heidi and Maxi.
I'll leave it. Maybe just very briefly, because one thing that kept striking me, maybe we have to talk about turning points. And again, a very nationally colored perspective, but one thing that surprised me, I think I saw a turning point in public opinion in Austria. Ukraine is not the neighbor anymore, but Ukraine is part of Europe. And I sometimes felt like actually public opinion went ahead and politicians just tried to follow. So I also think, what does it mean for our societies, of what we see happening now? Maybe we have to look a bit closer at the different levels within our countries.
Okay, I'm glad I'm just the chair and not one of the panelists. Especially because we are now at the time where we should be having our coffee break. So, but thankfully, we do have a lecture later on this evening where perhaps some of these themes will come up as well. So I suggest that we ask now the panelists to pick one specific issue that they think they can tackle in 2 minutes, and that we bring all the other issues and questions with us for this this afternoon's session. Does that sound okay? That you have a sort of a brief opportunity to pick some things, and there may be other things that you really would like to emphasize at this point as well, and then we take the rest of the ideas and comments with us.
I can immediately answer the Turkey question. The Turkish position is that there has to be a UN resolution for the sanctions to be implemented. So it's very straightforward. And every time that there was an international crisis on which Turkey joined in the sanctions, in 1990 Iraq, there was a significant loss for Turkey, which never was compensated. So the economy, the current state of the economy is not in a position to deal with it. But if there were a UN Security Council resolution, then Turkey would have went along with the sanctions.
Tom, if I may, pick 3 questions, but I'll be super short. Within 2 minutes. On the question of Oscar, I have 2 words for NATO strategic autonomy and so on. I think very simply, it will depend on US domestic policies in the first place. I think that will really be the key factor. But if it ever comes to sort of big security deal being negotiated, it will be the US and Russia doing it. It will not be the EU. So the EU's role will be secondary, I guess. Second point I wanted to pick up, if I could still find my way. Oh yeah, the label, if it's not geopolitical, is it ideological, civilizational? My question is just a question. My answer is a question back. Do we need a label? This is a very complex story. While we always want to categorize it, simplify it by having one label we can apply. So we'll be careful using any label, in particular at this stage, to use the name. Yeah? And if you say geopolitics, certainly geopolitics, that is very much discursive, that is subjective, that is based on information, that is critical geopolitics if you want. The last one I want to pick up is about the sanctions regime. Indeed, I think it's exceptional in terms of its scale, massive. The EU has never done anything like that. But it also it has a different target than the sanction regimes before. It is not about sending a signal to Putin, like the sanctions in 2014, but it's about crippling the war machine of Russia, as von der Leyen puts it. And I think that's a fundamentally new factor also in its turning point, if you want, in the sanctions regime.
Thank you, Tom. I'll pick up the question that was addressed directly to me on how does this fit with the decentering agenda. And I think a very simple way to say it is that it's the same conversation, just spoken in different terms and for different motivations, but actually in terms of action, like how to fix the problem, I think the kind of the decolonization and decentering, it's very much about the same outcome. So it's about who do we read, who do we cite, who do we invite, who do we listen to, which voices do we include, which literatures do we include, and how do we see authority and legitimacy for knowledge, how do we humility, did you use humility? And you said obligation, right? How, there's a really good piece on quiet as a research strategy. It's one of the theory talks, I think, by Hutchinson, saying, we need to quiet down and listen, like all of us. And I noted down here for myself, less is more, just do fewer things to a better depth. But our profession is in such a way that we need to do as much as possible. So we have no time for depth at all at this point. But I think in terms of practice, it's very similar and it's in our power, Who do we read? Who do we consider credible? Who do we include? Who do we engage with? And of course, local voices, whatever that may be, or kind of disciplinary, sub-disciplinary, sub-issue expertise, and just put the superiority complex away for a moment and just listen. And I had this on one of the slides, but I didn't have time to go into it. The East-West divide, and I had this quote from Dr. Phil. Do you want to be happy or do you want to be right? And it referred to the fact that Central Eastern European countries, and Gigan also picked up on this, have been saying this. Ukrainian scholars have been saying this. Opposition voices in Russia have been saying this, and they were considered laughable. I mean, they were literally laughed at. The number of times I've been told for being emotional and paranoid, I couldn't possibly count. Oh, you have this historic trauma. You act on the basis of history. We all do. You just have different history. So you don't see it coming. You should trust me and my understanding of my history with this subject, since you don't have history with this subject, right? So it's, in practice, it's the same. And I have a joke about proxy wars, but I don't know if we have time for
Keep it for the coffee.
I second everything that my co-panelists have said, and I invite everyone to coffee.
Thank you so much.
This joke about the proxy war, right?